Welcome back to Learning Knockout.JS. In the last section, we saw how to set up a project and display data using Knockout.JS. In this section, we're going to take a look at Knockout's two-way data binding and how it can help us create bidirectional communication between our view and view model. We'll cover the various HTML form elements and how to data bind each of them, and we'll explore several ways to manipulate form elements using other Knockout bindings. After we have a grasp on two-way data binding, we'll update our Knockout Media sample project by adding some views and view models to administer our media items and borrowers. In this video, we're going to dive into two-way data binding with the HTML input element. We'll data bind to a property in our view model and demonstrate what happens when we update the text in the input element. We'll also data bind an HTML button to trigger a function that will update the property so that we can see how the HTML input responds to the change. To get started, create a new HTML page for our view. Also, create a new JavaScript file for our view model. I'm going to name them data-binding.html and data-binding.viewModel.js. After you add the boilerplate code for the view model, switch over to the HTML and add your style sheet. Go ahead and set up your page title. And I'm going to go ahead and add some divs for our layout and content, as well as an h1 tag for our title on the page. Next, we'll want to add our script references, jQuery, Knockout.JS, and our view model. Then we'll add the initialization code to bind our view to our view model. Like we did in the last section, we'll use jQuery's ready function to signal us when the page is loaded. And then we'll ask Knockout to apply our bindings. Alright, we should be ready to go. Although the page isn't very exciting yet. Our plan is to bind an HTML input element to a property in our view model, so let's first add that property. We'll simply add a Knockout observable called message to our view model and initialize it with an empty string. Now we'll add an HTML field set and an ordered list for our form elements. In the first list item, we'll add an HTML input element with a data-bind attribute. When binding an HTML input element, there are two Knockout bindings you can use, value and textInput. The value binding simply binds the value attribute of the HTML input, text area, or select elements. The textInput binding is a little more specialized and limited to the HTML input and text area elements. It provides instant updates to and from the element's value attribute, the same as Knockout's value binding, but it also accounts for other types of user input like dragging and dropping values into elements, or when the user copies and pastes from the clipboard. In most cases, when using an HTML input or text area, use the textInput binding. Great! So now we have our HTML input bound to our message property, but how can we tell if the property actually updates? Well, there are a couple of ways. First, let's look at a built-in function of Knockout's observable object, the subscribe function. It allows us to see changes to an observable as they occur. Add a private initialization function to your view model and call that function before returning the module export. Then, inside the initialization function, call Knockout's subscribe function on the message property. The subscribe function's first parameter is a callback that passes the updated value of the observable whenever a change occurs. We'll show the value in the UI using a JavaScript alert. If we open our page in a browser and paste some text in the HTML input element, we'll get an alert that shows the current value of the message property. Of course, there are better uses for the subscribe function, but in this example, it helps us to see what's happening behind the scenes. Another way to show our output is to simply add an HTML element to our view and data bind the message property to it. Open your HTML document and add another list item with an HTML div element. Insert a data bind attribute and use Knockout's text binding to bind the message property from our view model. Go ahead and comment out the JavaScript alert in the initialization function before viewing the page again. This time, when we type in the HTML input, the value updates the message property in our view model, which in turn is observed by the UI and output to our div. We've seen how the view model gets updated from the view. Now let's update the message property directly and watch how the view responds. We'll start by adding an array of strings. I chose different colors for each array item. Then, we'll add a public function called loadMessage that updates our message property with a randomly chosen array element. And we'll format it out with a nice message. To call this function, let's add a button to our HTML field set and data bind our loadMessage function with Knockout's click binding. Notice that we use a reference to the loadMessage function as opposed to calling the function with parentheses. Whenever the button is clicked, it will call our function and update the message property. This change is observed by the UI bindings, and our HTML elements are updated with the new value. Congratulations! You can now perform two-way data binding between HTML input elements and a view model. And I think you'll agree that it takes very little code to accomplish this simple yet amazing feat. In the next video, we'll cover the remaining commonly used HTML form elements and show how to data bind them using Knockout's built-in bindings.